wow, my computer just spoke to me. Okay. Hello. Today, I'm here with Dr. Leland Harper. And as usual, I'm going to begin, Leland, by reading. I kind of took a snippet of the bio that's on the university website.
Yeah.
And I'll kind of read that so people can know a bit about you. Leland's an assistant professor of philosophy at Siena Heights University. And it says here your areas of specialization are in philosophy of religion and philosophy of race. And in philosophy of religion, you are particularly interested in the epistemic status of miracles and religious experiences, and also in the nature of omnipotence. And then you wrote your dissertation on the topic of your book on the multiverse theory and alternative concepts of God. So excited to talk about that with you today. And then in philosophy of race, you are particularly interested in topics related to racial solidarity and in exploring the terminology used to describe racist dispositions. Maybe we'll have to have you back another time to talk about those topics. That'd be really cool.
Yeah.
And then it says prior to entering academia, you spent 15 years in the restaurant and nightclub industry. So I'm sure you have some really interesting stories to tell working in that industry.
A lot of fun.
Yeah. And then aside from reading and writing, it says you're a huge baseball and basketball fan and can often be heard cheering for the Red Sox and the Clippers. So anyone who's watching, there you go. That's who he's rooting for. Thank you so much, Leland, for agreeing to do this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So I guess before we jump into talking about your book, so I want to plug that really quick while I'm thinking of it. I have it right next to me here. What we're talking about today is actually the subject of Leland's book, which looks like this. It's called Multiverse Deism. So please go pick up a copy. You can find it on Amazon and anywhere else that sells good books. But before we start talking about multiverse deism, I wanted to ask you, I noticed, I think it was on Facebook, there was a post about this, that you and one of your colleagues were just awarded a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to research and develop a certificate in diversity and inclusion at Siena Heights University. So could you tell us a little bit about that grant and what you're going to work on?
Yeah. So it's a small kind of exploratory grant, I guess, as you said, just to kind of explore the feasibility of a humanities-based diversity and inclusion program, or diversity, equity, and inclusion program at Siena Heights University. So I'm the director, and I have a co-director, Dr. Julie Barst, who is the director of the Ethnic and Gender Studies Institute at Siena Heights University. And so we've put together a team of other, humanities academics, some diversity, equity, and inclusion folks from other universities, from the University of Michigan, some business folks, some instructors that teach in our MBA program and our marketing program as well as some experiential learning specialists. And so the idea is that there's all these diversity and inclusion certificates that are out there, right? If you want to go and Google that, a bunch of certificates will come up. The thing that we notice is that there seems to be a bit of a gap in the material that they address, right? This is my daughter, of course, jumping on the couch.
Hello.
I don't know where the grandparents are right now.
That's okay.
We're monitoring this kind of thing. But yeah, we saw a kind of a gap. A lot of those certificate programs are focused on compliance, kind of how do we not look racist? How do we not get sued? How do we try to make kind of equitable policy and that kind of thing? And that's all fine, right? All that stuff is necessary if you're going into business or an organization or anything. But it doesn't seem to address too much of the underlying values that would seem to motivate us to jump through those hoops, right? It's one thing to be able to jump through those hoops. It's another thing to understand why we should be jumping through those hoops, or to be able to determine what those hoops should be. And so we think that a more robust certificate program that includes components from the humanities, so philosophy, history, literature, those kind of things, paired with the business aspect and the compliance aspect, will ultimately yield better more well-rounded professionals, and hopefully better more well-rounded people going out into the world. So we have a year to figure out, exactly what this certificate program would look like, cost, marketing, structure, course content, all that kind of stuff. And so that's what we're going to be looking at over the next year, which our grant program starts June 1st. So we have next week, we start meetings to figure everything out and go from there.
Man, that's really exciting. I really want to see how that goes. I mean, one thing I love about it is that you are kind of showing how important the humanities are. And it's also in the true spirit of liberal arts education is to form character and make better people. So that's amazing. Well, thanks for sharing that with me. And as I said, I mean, it would be really cool maybe at some point later on to have you back on to talk about some of your work in philosophy of race as well. And also maybe update us on what you're doing with that grant.
Yeah, of course.
But I suppose we should now segue into the topic at hand, talking about multiverse deism. So I suspect many people watching this, there are some people that have a background in philosophy, but a lot of people don't. And so both of these concepts, the multiverse and deism, are going to sound kind of foreign to them, perhaps. Yeah. So we'll have a chance to talk about that. I guess we should start by looking at the multiverse theory. Now, in the book, you point out there's not just a single multiverse theory out there, but there's kind of a cluster of different theories that go by that name. So maybe could you briefly outline some of the competing conceptions of the multiverse that are being discussed by scientists and philosophers today?
Yeah. So I guess when we're talking about multiverse, it's the general idea is just that there's more than one universe, right? So we're not the only one. There's at least one more. Most accounts typically have a lot more than just two. But at the basic level, it's just one more than us. So, there's a few philosophical ones and a few different scientific accounts that I address in the book. Some different arguments and structures, basically, for how the multiverse is set up and why we may be motivated to believe that we are part of a multiverse, right? So some of the most simple arguments are put forth by Jason Meagle. He has a bunch of arguments, but the two that are, that stick out most to me, at least, on the surface are, the premise that a multiverse exists is so weak that it's plausible, right? It's such a simple premise to operate with that we can't conclusively deny it, right? So because it's so simple, because it's so weak, it has to be plausible, right? Another argument that he puts forth is that there's no conclusive evidence that the multiverse doesn't exist. And this leaves it, again, possibly plausible. Right? So we kind of work with those two things, and that's just an easy way of setting that up. Right? So those are the arguments. We also have an account by Hud Hudson. Right? He has an account called the hyperspace account. And this is where he argues that, how do I put this? Hyperspace account is that there's more than 3 spatial dimensions that we kind of live in. What it does is it's made up, or what our kind of space is made up of, is different hyperspace dimensions. So we're kind of in this one plane right here, and then there's another one that we can't really access. It's right here, and another one, and another one. So they're just kind of stacked on top of each other in these different levels. And so I think I spoke with him briefly via email when I was writing this book. And the idea is that these different hyperspace levels, they're spatio-temporally distinct from one another. They are they're practically disconnected from one another. So we can't, I couldn't go from level 2 to level 3 or whatever it is. I couldn't go from this hyperspace to the next hyperspace practically, but theoretically I could. And so he seemed open to that possibility. So there's maybe a little bit of wiggle room there about how exactly those operate and what the different levels look like. But we could feasibly travel in between them, but practically that's probably not ever going to happen.
Right.
And then you have Klaus Cray. He presents a thing called the Theistic Multiverse. And this is where he argues that an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God would create the best possible world. But there's nothing in this account that says that the best possible world needs to be a single universe, right? The best possible world could be a series of universes, and it could include all the universes that are above some threshold for goodness, right? So every universe that is worth creating is created by God, right? And so that works together to create a multiverse, right? So those are some of the philosophical arguments that have been put forth, and some of the philosophical structures and ideas of the multiverse, right?
Yeah.
And so if we move into, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, I was going to shift over into the scientific part. So the science is not obviously something that I'm too familiar with, right? I'm a philosopher. That's kind of the lane that I stay in. But one of the things too is that, and then I speak about in the book, is that there does seem to be acceptance from the scientific community that multiverse theory is plausible, or at the very least possible, right? And so one of the accounts is put forward by David Deutsch, who is a physician, or not a physicist, sorry. And I'm just going to kind of read a quote, and this is Christopher Norris is speaking about David Deutsch here, and I think he puts it better than I could. But they speak about these things called wave packets. And so in this account, it says, every possible outcome of every wave packet collapse is simultaneously and actually realized through constant branching of alternative quantum worlds that are all of them equally real, though only one of them is epistemically accessible to any individual observer at any particular time. So what that essentially means is we're constantly moving through time and space, and pretty much every time we do something, a new branch shoots off to some kind of alternative, spatio-temporally distinct world, and we have counterparts over there that are doing something different, right? So just like when you and I sat down to do this interview, and we made that decision to come together and do this, there's some other branch somewhere else where Joshua decides this interview's over and he shuts off his computer right now, right? And so there's some Joshua counterpart somewhere else who does that. And there's some other Joshua counterpart who's wearing a red shirt, or some Joshua counterpart who doesn't have glasses, and likewise with me as well. And so all of those are equally realizable and are potentially being realized as well. But we're epistemically limited to the one that we're currently in, right? We can't see what's going on with those counterparts, right? I'm limited to this world where you and I are doing this interview. We both have glasses. You're wearing what looks like a blue blazer. I'm wearing a denim color thing, right? So that's what's accessible for us. And those are some of the different views. So the debate seems to be, at least in my kind of survey of the literature, the debate doesn't seem to be whether there is or isn't a multiverse, but the debate seems to be what kind of multiverse are we living in? What are the motivations for it? What are the structures behind it? How different are our laws of nature between these different universes? All that kind of stuff. Yeah,
and thank you so much. And it's really actually important that you pointed that out, that the multiverse theory or theories are taken very seriously by cosmologists. I mean, this isn't just some sci-fi kind of thing. I mean, this is there's some serious hardcore mathematics behind it, and research involved. And for anyone who might be interested, I know the Closer to Truth series, which has a lot of their videos on YouTube, they actually feature a lot of videos with scientists talking about. So if you're interested in maybe learning more about the science, and you're watching this, maybe go check some of those videos out to learn more about the science behind it. But today we're going to focus more on the implications, I guess, that the multiverse has for philosophy of religion. So this is what's so, I think, fascinating about your book, is that, well, you already kind of alluded to this, talking about the theistic multiverse. So there are theistic philosophers out there talking about the multiverse and the implications this would have. But in your book, you make kind of a strong argument that if there's a multiverse, this entails a certain conception of God. So I guess before we get into that, the nuts and bolts of that conception of God, which is called deism, could you, first of all, in your book, you kind of present your own novel argument for the existence of a multiverse, a theistic one. So do you mind kind of walking us through that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. And I will say, too, I mean, those closer to the truth videos are great. I use those in my courses for my students for not just this kind of stuff, but other stuff as well. And it's funny when I speak, you mentioned sci-fi, when I speak to my students about it, to say, have you ever heard about multiverse theory stuff? The two responses I always get are from Marvel stuff and from Rick and Morty. That's kind of where everybody's heard of this stuff, at least in the age range or the age group of the students that I'm teaching for the most part. But yeah, my account it's something I haven't developed too much on. I'm hoping to kind of get back into the philosophy of religion saddle after taking a little bit of a break and exploring some of this a little bit more. But the idea is generally that, if we accept something, for example, like free will is the greatest possible good, right? An omnipotent and omnibenevolent God would want to maximize the amount of free will that there is in the world, right? So I make the argument that free will isn't something that we can qualitatively measure. My free will isn't any greater than your free will or anything. It is what it is. But we can't measure it quantitatively, right? We can measure how many free choices I make versus how many free choices you make, or that kind of thing. And so I think that if we're measuring it quantitatively, there's an infinite number, or at least a very high number of choices that we can make, but that we would need our counterparts to make some of those choices, right? You or I only have a finite amount of choices we can make in any given world because we have a lifespan and all that kind of stuff, right? I can choose to have cornflakes for breakfast, or I can choose to have a bagel. If I choose cornflakes, choosing to have a bagel is an instance of exercising my free will that hasn't been satisfied, right? So there have to be a counterpart Leland somewhere else who chooses to have a bagel. That would kind of serve as 2 check marks for all the possible outcomes of that situation, thus maximizing free will. And we would obviously need multiple universes to achieve that, because I can't do both. Maybe that's a bad example because I can't have cornflakes and bagel for breakfast, but something bigger, right? I can't have cornflakes and not have cornflakes, right? And that doesn't make sense. So the idea is that we want to be able to maximize those. And so, there's a lot of stuff that goes on with free will and a lot of stuff that goes on with omniscience of God and whether we have that. And that's something I don't particularly engage with at this point. But I think the argument might hold even if you switch it from free will into something else, so acts of justice or being nice or any of that kind of stuff, right? All that kind of stuff. We may need counterparts to maximize those instances, right? If I want to give all my money to charity, I can certainly only give all my money to one charity. I can't give all my money to multiple charities. It doesn't really work that way, right? So I would need multiple counterparts. Yes, hon. Sorry, my dog's speaking to me.
It's quite all right.
Broken. I think your brother ate it. Yeah. You want to go back in color? Okay.
Hey, normally it's my kids doing this, so I'm don't feel bad.
This is the nature of working at home. This is the world we're in right now.
That's right. That's right.
She pops into all sorts of faculty meetings, all sorts of everything. So she's been in conference presentations.
That's amazing.
We were in a meeting with my lawyer the other day, actually. That's what it is.
That's brilliant. She gets to see firsthand what her dad is doing.
Oh, it's great. She likes reading she likes looking at books. So that's a positive. But yeah. My wife, as we were speaking about earlier, my wife works in healthcare. So I think she wants to do what mommy does during the day and then do what daddy does on the other days to go work at a school. So
that's fantastic. He's got 2 good role models, that's for sure.
I hope so.
So what you were talking about, I guess how you could also look at other areas like justice or happiness and some things like that, and still run the argument.
Yeah, I think so. Because there's going to be certain things that make me happy, and we can measure that qualitatively or quantitatively because that's something that lends itself to both, I think. But I don't know if I make this example in the book or that I speak about it elsewhere, but I can't be happy about eating the piece of cake that I have that's in front of me, and then also get the same happiness from saving that cake and having it later. And those seem to be 2 kinds of happiness that are incompatible with one another, given our spatio-temporal limitations. So we would need a counterpart in another world, or another universe to actualize that, right? And so that would be a situation where we could kind of get both those things checked off, thus satisfying this kind of maximal level of happiness that we ideally would hope that God would want to see in our world, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the idea there, is maximizing those quantitative and qualitative instances of whatever it is we want to deem, the greatest possible good.
Right. And so that gives a reason, I guess, for, okay, God to create a multiverse and not just like a single universe, like as traditionally conceived. But then that's going to lead us into thinking about, well, then what is the nature of the God who's brought about the universe, which is the huge focus of your book. So, I mean, the first part of your book, you're setting up this argument at the show. Look, here's an interesting reason to think that there is a multiverse that some.
Oh, I lost your sound for a minute there, Josh. Yeah. I can see that.
Oh, can you still hear me?
Yes, I got you back now.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure where I dropped off, but what was I saying? Yeah, I guess before we get into your arguments for why the multiverse entails a deistic picture of God, maybe we should step back and talk about deism. So this is a concept that not many people, I think, would have been familiar with. And even in contemporary philosophical literature, it's not really one that gets a lot of attention. I think all the attention seems to be on either classical theism, pantheism, or panentheism, those kind of things. So, could you just tell us a little bit about deism and maybe the history of it and your conception of it?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's something that's not terribly discussed or not widely discussed in contemporary philosophy of religion, or even really historical philosophy of religion for that matter. If you go do kind of a quick Google search of literature on deism, you get kind of these weird kind of pseudo-science kind of folk philosophy type things that come up, stuff that's been kind of, I don't know, I'm not going to say too much about it, but it's not academic in that sense, right?
Right.
We'll just say that. It's not academic. So, and so there's a few reasons for that, right? If you go back a few hundred years, right, we end up basically in a situation where you have these kind of, for the most part, British deists, but through most of Europe, I mean, deism is basically equated to atheism, right? So that's a huge problem if you're, living in the 1800s in Europe somewhere, or even America, really. But mostly Europe, the issue is going to be, okay, you're going to be punished in some way, right? If you're writing about being an atheist or speaking about being an atheist and basically just going against anything the church says, right? So deism in itself is, in the broad sense, just the idea that God doesn't act within our natural world, right? So all this stuff about miracles, all this stuff about Jesus being resurrected as the Son of God and, turning water to wine and walking on water and all that kind of stuff, didn't really happen. And so, there's a bunch of reasons we can say stuff about, or there's a bunch of different things we could say about the Bible and how exactly those words work as a narrative for certain other ideas. But in a literal sense, those are things that the deist wouldn't accept, right? So it's kind of along the same lines of any naturalistic religion or any naturalistic conception of God or view of God in that sense, that we have to kind of look for God through reason and not necessarily through any kind of actions that he may have done. So the motivations behind the reasons for why God doesn't act or hasn't acted, aside from creation, of course, those are varied. That isn't, there's not a ton out there. And so that's kind of the discussion that I'm hoping to start with this book, right? I don't say too much about the reasons why I think certain things are the way they are, why God doesn't act. I venture a little bit, but I leave that for the most part to be open. So the deistic God that I envision is one that still maintains all of your traditional theistic attributes of the, Judeo-Christian monotheistic God. So omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient, eternal / timeless, all those kind of things. That's all there. You just remove the God acting in the world part.
Yeah.
So that's how I envision deism.
That might be surprising to a lot of people who might assume that maybe you couldn't say those kind of things about a deistic God, because it looks pretty similar to God as he's conceived of by most analytic philosophers of religion, especially. Now, there was one thing, I'm sorry here, I didn't put this question in here, but I was just curious, because I think some people present deism as also entailing like there is that God's not sustaining the universe. So that seems to be another important part of classical theism.
Yeah.
And I wasn't sure, and maybe this is my own fault, not reading carefully enough. I wasn't sure what your position was on that. It seemed like maybe you didn't take God to sustain the universe's existence, but then I wasn't sure. So how does that fit into your conception of deism?
Yeah. Well, now it looks like the mother-in-law is now trying to get the daughter away. So you may hear some screaming at some point. Yeah, I mean, I've kind of given some thought to that. Bye. Good night. Good night. Yeah, I've given that some thought, and I think it's a distinction between the kind of actively sustaining or constantly having your hands in there and sustaining stuff on that kind of, I don't necessarily want to say micromanaging kind of level, but maybe active sustaining, versus kind of God set all the natural laws in place to sustain everything. So kind of an indirect sustaining, right? So I think that may be a way around it. So I think I would be, putting my deist hat on, which I think I may want to be a deist. I'm not completely sure yet, but if I put my deist hat on, I would say, no, God is not actively sustaining the world, right? He's not there making Joshua's heart beat. He's not there making, Leland's lungs work, all that kind of stuff, right? He's not doing all that kind of stuff. But at the moment of creation, whenever that would have been, he set it up so that there are plenty of natural laws in place to take care of all that stuff. So in that sense, I think you could still say that God is sustaining us through the mechanisms that he put in place, right? Just like I can technically say that, or maybe I could say that, or have faith that Bill Gates is maintaining my computer right now because of whatever software updates come through Microsoft, right? Bill Gates isn't necessarily in there actively making my computer work, but he set up the framework of this big multi-billion or possibly trillion-dollar company that makes all that stuff happen, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I'm thinking about.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so that I think that even pushes you even closer than to the classical theist kind of framework in some ways, because you're willing to say, well, there's maybe
Oh, I lost your audio for a sec. I think you're back.
Am I back?
You're back. We're good.
That time I caught it. I didn't just keep talking. I was like, I froze. So okay, great. So now we have an idea.
Uh-oh, we froze. You there? Oh, you're moving again.
Oh, did I? And that time I did keep talking, didn't I?
Uh-oh. Yeah, I think so. You froze. I tried to tell you, but it didn't really do anything.
I'll try it again. The good news is I can cut this awkward stuff out. And
Go with it.
Okay, or maybe I'll leave it in and just leave the awkwardness. That's all.
Yeah, why not?
Make it more entertaining.
Why not, right?
So, okay, yeah. So, I guess now that we have an idea of what deism is, and now we can shift back into trying to understand your reasons for thinking that if there's a multiverse, then this entails the deistic conception of God. So, could you walk us through that argument?
Yeah. So I guess I'll say first that the kind of multiverse that I deal with, at least in this book, is just this all possible universes exist, right? So we're going to end up with a kind of multiverse in which every possible outcome is actualized either in space or time in some or well, at some particular location at some particular time in this multiverse, right? So if it's possible that there is a Joshua who doesn't wear glasses, that's actualized somewhere. Or if every Josh in the world has to wear glasses, or every counterpart of you has to wear glasses, then that's just a necessary thing. And
that would be my luck.
Yeah. And there are no worlds where you cannot have glasses, right? And that's just not a possibility. It's going to be logically impossible, basically, for our purposes there. So the idea is that if everything possible is actualized at some place or at some point, there really doesn't seem to be a need for God to stick his hand in their metal in any particular world, right? If it's possible that everything happens, then it would seem to indicate some sort of deficiency in God to stick his hand in there and meddle with us. It would seem to argue that either his omnipotence wasn't there at the beginning, at the time of creation, and that he couldn't create the world in the way that he necessarily wanted to through the operation of natural laws, and he has to then come in and amend his creation at some later time. Or maybe it points to a lack or a deficiency in his omniscience, and that he wasn't able to foresee how we would carry on with our free will, or how some of these natural laws would guide the world. So I just think that it seems to create more problems than it solves. And there just doesn't seem to be any reason for God to, insert himself, right? Especially in a situation where we have natural laws, right? Laws of nature guide the world. That is one mode that kind of dictates how everything works in our observable universe, right? There just doesn't seem to be a need to insert some other explanation for the way things go. That would seem to me to point to a defective God in some way, coming in and amending after the fact, right? If you could sit down and write the perfect philosophy paper from start to finish without having to go back and edit, right, you would do that, right? You would be all-powerful Joshua writing the perfect philosophy paper from start to finish. I assume that is not how you operate, right?
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, that's not how any of us operate, because we're not all-powerful philosophers. We're not the greatest possible philosopher, right? We sit down, we write, we go back, we edit, we go back, we edit, we revise. We kind of go back and do these things, right? That's our process. God shouldn't have to go back and revise anything, right? If God is this amazingly powerful being, this amazingly, loving being, this amazingly knowledgeable being, he knows how to do whatever it is that he wants to do, and he's able to do whatever it is that he wants to do. And those things are going to be perfect. So I just don't see any reason for this kind of lack of efficiency in having a second mode of bringing about states of affairs in the world. And for him, I mean, if he desires to see a Joshua without glasses, everything in the multiverse is immediately available to him, right? He's that kind of all-seeing eye. It makes no difference to him if it happens in this universe or some other universe in the multiverse. We kind of lose that. I mean, I know it sounds maybe harsh to hear, but you as a Josh don't matter to God any more than Josh 47, who's your counterpart in some other universe, right? You're both equally maximally loved and maximally cared about, or whatever terminology you want to use. So it just seems that if it were the case that God was going to act in any universe, it would be kind of arbitrary and unnecessary. And so that's kind of how I take it, that just brings us to the point where we can remove God's activity from our world, maintain all the other good stuff, or the other attributes, and still be pretty good.
Yeah. So I was just listening as you talk about this. I imagine there's maybe I'm wrong, but some of the other motivations you have here is trying to maybe maintain a conception of God that's really close to classical theism, in the face of, say, some of these contemporary challenges to like miracles and things like that. Am I right in thinking that was maybe some background motivation for the project?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things is, if I put out a conception of God, that's just way out of left field, right? It just doesn't maintain any kind of attributes that are similar to what, we're talking about in the Judeo-Christian monotheistic tradition. Nobody's really going to buy it, right? It seems like it'd be more culty than kind of a general mainstream alternative conception of God or concept of God, right? So if you look at Eric Steinhardt speaks about the flying spaghetti monster. I think it is, right? We can talk about a God who, does all these things. Nobody's really going to buy into that. You might get a couple dozen people who are a little bit crazy who might buy into it, but that's not ultimately what I'm going for, right? I'm going for a reasonable argument for a concept of God that we can work with. And so, it maintains a lot of the key features, most of the key features of the God that billions of people around the world accept. But I think it does a couple things a little bit better than that conception of God, right? So as you mentioned it, I think it deals with some of these arguments against miracles, some of these arguments for atheism. So, right, you have some atheists, having arguments against miracles, like, that's not quite true. Maybe we missed some natural laws, that kind of stuff. Maybe you were drunk or whatever it was. You didn't see what you thought you saw, right? That's all perfectly fine. Deism doesn't have to deal with any of that. The theist, the classical theist, has to address those in some way, right? The deist doesn't. The deist says that's not a problem for us. We take those miraculous things, in the Bible, for instance, to be just stories, tools, learning opportunities for the rest of the people who are reading it or hearing about it. But they didn't literally happen. And so I think that's the upshot of deism.
Yeah, I think it's important that you said that because some people, especially if you're not involved, I mean, philosophers, we're kind of funny people. We're asking really odd questions and we're challenging ideas that are commonly held. But outside of the philosophy bubble, that's not always the case. So someone might hear about multiverse deism or hear about your book and think, oh, maybe he's just trying to attack my beliefs or something. But actually, it's the opposite. You're really trying to say, no, I think there's something, you're trying to preserve a conception of God in the face of some of these contemporary challenges. So hopefully that'll come off that way to people watching this to see that.
Yeah. And I think in some of my conversations I've had about this, right, it's that, hey, science is kind of saying these things about, the construct of our universe that just doesn't quite seem to gel with our traditional concept of God, right? So one of the things is the teleological argument, right? And the idea that our universe is so precisely designed that there had to be a God who, tuned all those things, right? For anything to exist. That goes out the window if we're just one of an infinite number of universes, right? It would just be inevitable that this universe exists and nothing is special about us. That's problematic, obviously, for the theist, right? Yeah. Not so much for the deist, right? I mean, that's kind of just how it would have been. God wasn't in there necessarily fine-tuning anything. It's just he created everything and stepped back, right? And that's perfectly fine. And so we want to find ways to maybe maintain that conception of say, hey, science is going this way, but I still want to believe in God. But how do I maybe have a little bit of a shift in how I think about God to still be able to preserve my faith, still be able to preserve my belief, and move forward, right? And that's kind of what we're looking to do, right? Or what I'm looking to do with this project, and hopefully start a little bit more conversation about some specific ways that we can do those things.
Yeah. Well, Leland, thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation of the ideas in your book, and I really appreciate you taking time to join me and answer these questions I had. And for anyone watching, here's a picture of the book again. Go out, get a copy. Unfortunately, they are a little bit expensive, as academic books are always a little bit pricier, but it's worth spending money on academic books. You get some really interesting ideas.
We also have ebooks. Ebooks are a little bit cheaper, so we have ebooks. And if anybody wants to email me, find out my email address from Google me. I'll come up. I'll send you a promo code.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So now you don't have an excuse. Email. In fact, if you don't mind, do you want me to put your email underneath the YouTube video? Or
yeah,
would that
throw it in there. We can get you. It looks like we can probably get you 30% off. So you can get it for $30.
Oh man. Okay. Yeah. So I'll do that. Then you don't have an excuse. You have to go get his book. Well, man, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I meant what I said earlier. I think we should, if you're open to it, have you back at some other point to talk about some of the other work you're doing in philosophy of race, because I think that's not a topic that I know very much about, and I would love to hear more about what you're working on and writing. I think you said you had it was a co-edited volume or a co-authored volume.
Yeah, so I have a book that I'm co-authoring with my colleague Jen Kling over at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. So that should be coming out next spring. But yeah, it's something that I've dipped my toe in just out of personal interest and to take a little bit of a break from this philosophy of religion stuff. Right, I did it for probably about 10 years straight. So I want to take a little bit of a step back and just the world that we're living in now and all the stuff that's going on. It's a personal interest to me, and I think it's important work. So yeah, that's kind of where I've been for the last few years, is working on that. But yeah, I'm more than happy to come back and have some conversations about what I'm working on there.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to that. But until then, thank you very much, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Of course. Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it.